and welcome to the RubySorce podcast. Today I'm joined by Noah Gibbs, who is Senior Staff Software Engineer at Shopify. Noah, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thrilled to be here.
Good. So as always, we're going to start by talking a bit more about your, when you started programming, working with Ruby, Rails, talk us through right at the beginning.
Sure. So I'm an old guy. When I started programming, it wasn't in Ruby originally. I like to say I got started programming by being bored. I grew up in the middle of nowhere in East Texas. Technically there's a gigantic prison in my hometown, but it's less thrilling for a small child than you might think. No, I got an Apple II eventually. It took a while to wheedle my parents into it, and wasn't a real common thing. There weren't a ton of them around. But Apple II shipped with AppleSoft Basic, and so I did my best to learn AppleSoft Basic. There was nobody around me really that wrote programs. I mean, technically my aunt wrote a few, but she didn't really know what she was doing either, and didn't spend a lot of time on it. She's one of those weird old rich people that makes quilts that you can look at with a little 3D glass and things like that, and has old random stuff, very random stuff.
Sure.
And so she had an Apple IIc in the same way that she made weird 3D quilts. And so I didn't necessarily know a lot because there was nobody near me that knew much of anything. But I put a lot of time into it, and I learned a lot of the things I thought you were supposed to learn at the time. And I eventually went off to university and Carnegie Mellon, got a degree in that. So I've been doing computer stuff for a long time, and I've just kind of wandered through different companies doing different things. I've worked in mobile, and I've worked in GPU, and I've worked on big servers, and obviously I've done web programming for a little while here, and a lot of embedded, a lot of random stuff. As far as how I got into it, Ruby took me a while. I was working outside of Ruby for a very long time first. I tend to say I was classically educated as a software engineer, and what I mean by that is I was one of those people that wouldn't give you the time of day about things like the web and databases and other sort of populist stuff. No, I work on real programming. Not anymore. You used to be like that. Which is frustrating and kind of alienating and weird, and you work on giant teams. And I've got to say, in retrospect, it wasn't that good, but at the time I was very convinced it was the way to go.
Sure. And then Ruby. So when did Ruby come into your life?
Sure. So at some point I realized that I was really frustrated by joining a company, working on a giant team on the same project for years, and in effect it never shipped one way or another. I mean, we often, shipped the thing, we marked it complete, but often it would require selling it to another giant company and being integrated into another product. If you make a chip for a cable TV set-top box, you're relying on another company to go make a cable TV set-top box. If you make a mobile operating system, you're relying on somebody else to ship a phone that uses it. And so I had a number of products I worked on that I thought were pretty good products that just never shipped, never saw the light of day. No actual human could go buy one ever at any point. And I got tired of that. And I thought, well, what if I go out and I ship people a thing? Now, because again, I had this this sort of traditionalist software engineer orientation, and I sort of spec'd out what that would look like. What if I could ship something that people could actually use on different computers, and made a bunch of installers. I don't know if app installers are terrible. They're still really awful, but they weren't any better. This would have been in 2007 or something. They weren't any better then. I thought about, well, what I wanted to do for a cross-platform presentation layer, something where I could write it. And I looked at the existing cross-platform window managers, and they weren't great. They're still not great, but they weren't great then. I realized when I'd sat down and put together what I actually wanted to do that I'd spec'd out a web browser. Now, I'd seen just enough PHP to be convinced that web programming was hideous and barbaric. I sort of sighed deeply, because every few years I'd go look at web programming and go, yes, this is awful, I'm not touching this. But in my own way, I was trying to be broad-minded, and so I'd at least go look every few years. And in 2007, I happened to be looking at the same time that the Ruby on Rails 15-minute blog tutorial was a thing.
Okay.
And that was interesting. Like I sat down and I looked at that. And so I was used to traditional software engineering languages, traditional programming languages. And I looked at that and it really just said what it did. There was only as much there as you needed to specify
Sure.
what it was doing,
Sure.
which was just kind of a revelation. Like the languages I'd used didn't look like that. Like I'm
Sure.
not the only one that got smacked in the face with that with the Ruby blog, the Rails blog tutorial. But like I wasn't used to languages that looked like that. And I looked at that, and first I had the sort of whoa, well that's a weird little curiosity. I'm sure it's too slow to be useful in practice, but that's neat. Somebody's out there trying that. And I stopped
True.
and I realized that was a web language that wasn't horrible.
Yeah.
And I sighed deeply, and I sort of slumped where I was. And I looked up at it and I thought, this means that I'm going to need to teach myself databases and JavaScript and CSS. Okay. And so for the next 2 years of spare time,
Yeah.
I'd come home and I'd sit on my couch and I'd work on learning the stuff for Ruby on Rails. I taught myself SQL and I taught myself JavaScript and I taught myself CSS. Not terribly well at the time because I was starting almost completely flat-footed. Like
Sure.
I hadn't
Sure.
really even learned HTML at that point. But for about 2 years, I did that. Now, after you do that for a little while, and I subscribed to Ruby Weekly, which came out with just a fearsome fire hose of stuff. It took me a long time to get to the point where I understood everything in a given week of Ruby Weekly.
Sure.
But at some point I stumbled across the idea of meetups. Now I was a C programmer before that. Like meetups, the idea that you get together with other programmers and sit and talk about it, that seems a little weird. Why would programmers do that? I mean, you've got a team at work, but why would programmers do that? They
Sure.
had conferences, and that was really too weird for me coming from C. But after I'd spent a while trying to teach to just inhale again CSS and SQL and all of these new skills, I got to the point where I was terrified to meet other Rubyists because looking at the sheer volume of stuff that I was trying to do, and Rubyists clearly were people that understood all of these things.
Yes.
Like
Yes.
this was taking me a lot of time, and I considered myself pretty clever. And so I was just terrified to go out and meet Ruby people. I finally did around about the same time I started looking for my first Ruby job. And of course, those of you who've been to Ruby meetups, which is, I'm sure an awful lot of your audience know what the punchline looks like. It turns out that they are not superhumans that have learned all of these things
No.
at an unreasonable
Absolutely.
level. It turns out, they're people, they're programmers.
Yeah.
And while they do know a reasonable variety of stuff, they're friendly. But yeah, and so having done that and studying just as fast as I possibly could, because again, I was deeply intimidated by all of this, I managed to be the Ruby expert starting from my very first Ruby job, which took me a while to get, because when you've been doing systems programming for 10 plus years, plus before that, the sales pitch kind of goes, "Hi, I've been doing this a while. I'm expensive. I've never worked on anything you work on. And so I have no professional experience doing anything you care about. Hire me."
Yes.
As a sales pitch, it's about as effective as it sounds like, but so
Yeah.
it took a while.
True.
But yeah, I did find a shop full of Java people trying to add a layer of JRuby on Rails on top of their Java server, and that was a good enough match that they were willing to say yes, and I was willing to give it a try. And I switched from being architect on a co-architect on a mobile operating system, to going off and doing this other thing instead. Which I sort of feel bad about because I won't say I left them in the lurch. Like things were basically at the place where they needed to be, but it turned out it was another of those things that never shipped. Like so many of those things. We got this thing, and it Engadget wrote nice articles about it. We had great screenshots, but it required my company to successfully sell it to a company that was going to ship a phone to convince a phone carrier to use it, and that just never happened. So it's just as well I didn't stick around and wait.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, so that was a lot of how I got into Ruby on Rails was about 2 years of study on my couch.
Fine. And so what's happening at the moment? What's some interesting stuff that you're working on right now at Shopify?
Sure. Well, so at Shopify, I work on Widget. Some of your listeners will have heard about Widget, which is It's not the first JIT to ship in Ruby on Rails, but it's the most recently replaced one, and it's the preferred one, the recommended one. MJIT, which was its predecessor, has actually been taken out in favor of RJIT. The same guy works on, like, he's on the YJIT team, and he works on both of those. Takashi Kokubun, and I don't know when the man sleeps. Like, he's ludicrously productive. But yes, he's replaced the old JIT for Ruby on Rails. He was sort of relieved to do it because he was having trouble getting it to be fast enough, and now at this point it's down to like kind of deprecated or experimental status, and he can basically go, great, like now YJIT, which I get paid to work on, and we've got a team working on it, can be the real one, and I can have fun doing experimental research sort of stuff, and it's frankly working out a lot better. I mean, for him and everybody, like MJIT was a large improvement over not having a JIT, but it was never going to do what we're currently doing with YJIT, and so I think he was thrilled to stop having to maintain this thing that was never gonna get to where he wanted it to be.
For sure.
Yeah. Anyway, yeah, but YJIT's a lot of fun. I don't know, we rewrote it in Rust a while back. In this case, not from Ruby to Rust, but from C to Rust.
Okay.
Because the C Ruby is written in C, and so initially we wrote the JIT in C, and so whatever language we use has to work with that. So it runs Ruby, but I don't know. Language stuff is always a little funny because there's what it's written in, and then there's the fact that it is Ruby. But yeah, so YJIT's a lot of what I've been doing recently at work and for Shopify. I do a tremendous amount of benchmarking. So if anybody hasn't heard of me, that's probably a number of you. Speed.ygit.org. I put that one together. And so if you want to see a lot of graphs about exactly how fast multiple Rubies are, which again is a lot of what I do, speed.ygit.org is a fun way to go. Look at all the latest graphs and see how fast we are on different benchmarks. And if you're the sort of person who does benchmarking, feel free to submit one. We'd love to run your benchmark along with the rest of them and have extensive graphs for them.
Sure. And then, so tell me more about Scarpe, because Scarpe seems like a very interesting project. And tell the listeners, or the viewers, should I say, more about the name and where that's come from and that sort of thing, because I think this is all quite interesting, actually.
Sure. Yeah, Scarpe is not what Shopify pays me to do, but it is a thing I'm doing a bunch of. So some of you will remember Why the Lucky Stiff. He had a legal name like the rest of us, but that was the name he went by, and he preferred his pseudonym for all purposes. He didn't tell people about the rest of it. But he did a lot of cool stuff for Ruby. He wrote Why's Poignant Guide to Ruby, which back before weird programming language books were much of a thing, like it was the one, and it brought a lot of programming people to Ruby. It was fun. It's still fun. It's still good if you get a chance to read it. But he wrote Hprocot, which was the XML parser that preceded Nokogiri. A lot of his stuff, he had these fun interface ideas and people used it. Camping, which was one of the first ever micro frameworks for web stuff. Like, he wrote that. It's still out there. He wrote a thing called Hackety Hack, which was a little self-contained programming environment so that you could get everything installed to do like music and video and stuff and do fun stuff. Shoes was the name of his UI library. So if you want to write little UI apps that just run locally, like not web apps, but just local apps in Ruby, there's no reason you can't do it. And Shoes was a little library to do that. But Shoes was written extending Ruby fairly directly. It was written like C extensions to Ruby, which means that it's aged very poorly. It was written for much older Ruby things. So Why disappeared a while back. Basically, somebody figured out who he was, doxed him, and he evaporated off the web. He took down his GitHub repositories. He took down his websites. Like, he went away. But a lot of his stuff is still remembered, and some of his software has been rewritten or repurposed. Again, Camping's still around. But Shoes is hard to use because Shoes was written in this way that it needed a lot of maintenance, and then he went away. And so there have been a few attempts to rewrite Shoes over the years, ours included. What we did was we started from WebView, which is roughly what it sounds like. It's kind of like Electron. It's a way of building little web apps. And so Marco Rudeloso, who works with me and Nick Schwaderer at Shopify, had put together a fun WebView wrapper and did some great prototyping work. And so Marco and then Nick and then me, we put together essentially the start of a Shoes clone built in WebView. And so because Marco is an Italian guy with an Italian name, we used the name Scarpe, which is Italian for shoes. for our little wrapper. And so Scarpe has been fun. Like we started with WebView, but we kept it flexible on back end, and so we've got like a libui back end, and we're trying to figure out sort of what the long term will be. And in the meantime, we have a modular layer that lets us do it as a WebView app or do it as a libui app, and different things. So in addition to, so it started as a hack week project, like Shopify does periodic hack week projects. And so Marco had already built this stuff, and we went, let's build shoes. And so we had about a week with me and Nick and a few other people having time. And so we put together, this, but we've kept at it. There's a Discord server, there's a GitHub org. And so we're still doing it. And in fact, we got a couple of Google Summer of Code interns who are helping us out. So we're seeing fun stuff. A fellow named Giovanni is building a WASM display library. So we think we're going to have a WebAssembly display library for it soon. Cross your fingers, but that'd be great. That'd be fun.
Nice.
And Pawan is doing a wide variety of stuff, basically implementing new features, a lot of stuff that we haven't necessarily gotten to. Shoes is a fairly big API, and so he's completing all the little stuff that we didn't necessarily get to, in the hack week and the time afterwards. Yeah, we're doing all kinds of stuff right now. I'm trying to stabilize it as much as anything. WebView, it turns out, is not all the way baked, and so we're there's a lot of just kind of figuring out how to test it and figuring out how to make it run a little more reliably and things like that. And testing a GUI library is always fun. It's always difficult to get reliable tests that run locally and run on the CI server, etc. Anyway, doing a bunch of that. But the cool thing about Scarpe, the cool thing about really any kind of UI library is you can see a lot more of what you're doing really immediately and directly. So much of programming is sit around and think about a thing and then write some code, and you don't get to see directly what you're doing. I mean, maybe you write tests and it tells you if it succeeds or fails, but it's so much kind of imagine it in your head.
Yeah.
And the nice thing about a UI library is you can tell it to pop open a window, you can click a button, you can do at least a little bit of interacting with it like a thing that exists. And it's a lot more satisfying when you can do it. That's that tight interaction loop that we talk about. It's cool to have tests, but it's much better to feel like you're messing with it and touching it. I think it's one reason that so many people get into programming from game programming, because nice thing about a game, you can see it, you can do something with it.
Yeah.
The whole point of it is you can poke at it. Like otherwise, it's not a game.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And no. Please go on.
Oh, I was going to say, Scarpe has been good because I spent a while reading. Okay, so there's a guy named Seymour Papert. He was one of Piaget's students. I don't know if you know Piaget, but in case your viewers don't, Piaget is a famous child development researcher. And so when you talk about object permanence, where the kid sees a ball rolls behind the chair, at some point the kid gets old enough to figure out that the ball didn't disappear; it's behind the chair.
It's behind the chair.
Object permanence. Yeah.
Sure.
Similarly, you pour water from one container into a different shaped container, and at some point the kid's old enough to figure out that that's the same amount of liquid because you poured it out of the same container. Piaget studied a lot of these things, but he was recent. Like he was recent enough that some of his students are still alive. And so Seymour Papert was one of his students, but was also the guy who wrote Logo. Like, the Logo programming language with the little turtle and you tell it to turn and go for. So Logo wasn't designed for computers exactly originally. Logo was designed to have a bunch of kids writing lists of instructions, and one kid reads the instruction list and the other kid acts it out as the turtle.
Sure. Right.
Logo was designed to teach debugging as a skill that didn't necessarily have anything to do with computers, with kids and instructions written on paper. Like, it works well on computers. He did intend it to be used on computers, but he also intended it to be used without the computers because, especially when he was doing it, you couldn't get that many computers. And so something where you can do it with kids and paper works out really well. But no, it turns out Papert was one of Piaget's students and designed Logo very much with this in mind, and wrote a whole series of books that are sort of about computers, but are mostly about educating kids. And so, a nice thing about Scarpe that this is letting me kind of get to and be able to do is to think more about how to write programming stuff that is not entirely repellent to people who are new to this. Like, so many of our tools are so bad. They're bad for teaching, they're bad for learning, they're bad for figuring this stuff out. I'm not gonna, cite a whole bunch of other people because I can't imagine that too many people sit here to, oh, could you give me a long list of people that, I haven't read to tell me, this much about them? Like, I know that gets old fast. But it's a good chance to think about how badly we teach this stuff and how we can maybe do a little better, in the same way that shoes actually. Shoes is a really simple, really satisfying little language for building these UI apps. And so it's a good start, like I'm not necessarily the best person at UX design. I'm not necessarily the best person at making something friendly, but I'm not so bad that I can't take something friendly and make something better by just letting him make the decisions, like why put together a good language here? And that's part of why I like using shoes for it. Shoes is good. And even if I couldn't make something that friendly, I can still steal his thing.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Good. Okay. And Shopify. So what's happening at the moment? I know you mentioned the project that you're working on. How's everything going?
Well, probably the loudest thing that's happened at Shopify lately was that 20% layoff that happened a fairly short time ago. That was big news. Man, I don't remember how much we talked externally about why it happened. The short version was things aren't unstable there. Like they announced better than expected earnings. They were selling off Shopify logistics, but it turns out that wasn't so much because there was anything wrong with the logistics group. Flexport bought it and paid decent money for it.
Sure.
No, Shopify decided it wasn't interested in being in the logistics business, which makes a lot of sense once you know a lot about the logistics business. I mean, you spend all of your time sort of doing micro optimization of these supply chains, and I can see why we didn't want to be in the logistics business. I wouldn't. But part of it was just they're kind of natural sizes for a company. You get to about 10,000, and that's a decent sized company. There are some other smaller sizes of companies that also work really well, but when you get above that natural size, it's pretty much, if you've thought about it, then you're doing it to kind of sprint to the next bigger natural size.
Sure.
And I don't know exactly where the stopping points are, but the next big obvious natural size after 10,000 is 100,000, and that would be awfully big for what Shopify is. Like Shopify's not really looking at being 10x its current size. And so my understanding is Shopify kind of decided here's a natural size and we're past it. Especially like if we kept doing logistics, then 100,000 would be a natural size. But also, Shopify would have to be primarily a logistics company by headcount.
Sure.
And so they decided they weren't doing that, and that changed how big the whole company could be.
Yeah. It's interesting. Okay, and then we wanted to finally finish off and talk a bit more about your book. So I think many of the viewers hopefully will, like you said, know who you are and know what your book is. But tell us a bit more about rebuilding Rails.
Sure. If there's one thing I've done that more people know me for than anything else, it's going to be rebuilding Rails. So the basic idea, in case you're one of today's lucky 10,000, is that you understand Rails by building something structured like Rails. Rails only looks like magic because you haven't necessarily seen that kind of metaprogramming in Ruby. Ruby lets you do some operations collectively referred to as metaprogramming that most languages don't let you do. And Rails looks the way it does because it uses these slightly uncommon features. So what you can do is learn the feature, build a system with the feature structured like Rails, and now you know what Rails does, because there's only so many ways to build a particular thing. In Ruby, you've got to require your dependencies explicitly. Not in Rails. Rails just does it automatically. How? The answer is something called const missing. And if you search for that, you can find a bunch of blog posts. I wrote one of them. But the short version is that these weird things in Rails that look like magic are, you take this weird feature that Ruby has that most languages don't, you figure out what can be done with it, and you're going to suddenly see why Rails does what it does. Because most of what Rails is it's a very skillful, considered usage of this Ruby feature that most people haven't seen. So if you get to about mid-career and you say, Rails seems too much like magic with me, too much like magic for me, I don't like it, one of your options is to go learn a lot more about Rails so it doesn't seem like magic. And in that case, rebuilding Rails is for you. I came from a very C and traditional background, and I tried to, wrap my head around Rails. And part of how I did this was to go down and explore because I don't like bits of the system I can't understand. And so I went and learned all those metaprogramming features and how Rails used them. And so the book is pretty much my distrust for Ruby, which turned into an understanding of Ruby, distilled into book form. And if anybody's curious about the same thing, I actually do roughly the same trick in rebuilding HTTP, which is just a different part of the web stack, but same deal. If you wonder what is this magic thing that app servers like WebRick and Puma, et cetera, do, the short answer is they're socket servers that speak HTTP. But in case that doesn't necessarily mean much to you, you can build it from nothing, and then you will know exactly what it means.
Okay, good. So finally, wanted to finish off. What's the future hold for you, for Noah, in terms of work and what you up to? Any more books on the horizon? That sort of thing.
Well, so I've written Rebuilding HTTP, but there's a whole marketing phase to a book that takes a long time and a lot of work, and I frankly haven't done nearly enough of it. And so some of it's going to be that. I don't know what the next book will be after that. There may well be one. It wouldn't surprise me. I keep trying to find a way to tie into this teaching stuff, because while Rebuilding Rails it's unusually good for a book. I mean, for a tech book, it's very much, you want to build a thing, here's what you want to build, here's the code, do it, now here's how you debug it, here's what's likely to go wrong. That's cool and all, but it's not very approachable. Like, if you're already a mid-career engineer, it's better than almost anything else out there. There are not very many good books for them. And frankly, I think Rebuilding Rails does a really good job of doing that. But that doesn't mean I couldn't do better. I wrote that 10 years ago now. If I can't do better, I've been doing something wrong, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, of course.
But I'm looking for other ways to kind of bring that teaching down to a level that's more approachable for more people. One way or another.
And what's the best way for people to reach out to you? So if you've got more junior developers that are, that have got questions for you or want some advice, how's the best way for them to reach out to you?
All right. So you can find me on Mastodon without too much trouble. I've got a Twitter account, but if the Twitter account looks, kind of moribund, that's because it is. I don't do much there anymore. So I am Codefolio at RubySocial. I also have the domain codeful.io. So Codefolio with a dot before the IO. That's me too. If you Google Noah Gibbs, I'm easy to find. I sell books online. I'm not hard to Google for.
For sure.
Yeah, but terrible secret that we all tell all the time and nobody knows it anyway. Those of us who are very online and write books, etc., we actually respond to email constantly, because it turns out that I may be famous as Ruby authors go. It's not a long list of people, but it turns out that's not real famous in the world at large. I am thrilled to see your email, and I basically always answer. And most of the other Ruby authors are the same way. Only David Heinemeier Hansen is an actual race car driver and like real world famous. The rest of us are happy to talk to Ruby people all the time.
Sure, absolutely. Noah, thank you so much for coming on today. It's been a pleasure chatting with you.
Likewise, it's been great being here. Been great chatting with you.
Absolutely, thank you so much.